Imagine waking up one day to realize that everything you'd built your life upon, all the teachings, the memories from childhood, the prayers uttered in quiet desperation, the promises of salvation whispered from pulpits bathed in gold, might have been hiding something from you. Not because the truth was lost, but because it was erased. Picture being told that your suffering has purpose, that pain is part of some divine test, yet sensing a more disturbing possibility beneath that comfort. What if the world isn't broken because of sin, but because it was never supposed to exist this way at all? You scroll through texts, centuries-old scriptures, some familiar, some buried. You come across fragmented words from forgotten scrolls. The world ruler is blind, he said, I am God and there is no other beside me, and he did not see the origin from which he came. You pause. Who is this ruler? Why is he blind and why does he lie? A chill runs through you. Because the God being spoken of is the God of Genesis. That's what the Gnostics believed. Suddenly, the lines between good and evil blur, bleed into one another until the very foundation of faith begins to shake beneath your feet. Why did the early church burn these texts, excommunicate those who spoke of this secret cosmology? Why did emperors and bishops agree on dogma, not through revelation but through counsel and suppression? Does truth thrive in silence, or is it revealed in what we're forbidden to ask? Gnostic Christianity wasn't heresy for being chaotic. It was heresy because it offered too much order. It rewrote the narrative. The God of light? Not the creator, but the liberator. The serpent in the garden? Not the deceiver, but the revealer. The true God? Hidden, silent, unreachable through dogma, but found within, like an ember smoldering beneath the ashes of illusion. You start to question everything. What if salvation isn't about obedience, but remembrance? What if good and evil aren't cosmic absolutes, but illusions born from duality itself? What if Eve didn't fall, but awakened? What if the original sin was forgetting who you are? And this thought, it doesn't damn you. It sets you on fire. Or you really? Not who society tells you. Not the name, the job, the identity crafted by years of indoctrination and repetition. Who are you, stripped bare of every borrowed belief? Inside every religion there lingers an undertow. Something deeper than rituals or doctrines, something that feels like it's always just out of reach. Like a memory you never fully formed, but somehow keeps haunting you. In Gnostic Christianity, this memory is called gnosis. Not belief, knowing. But here's the disturbing part. If the knowledge was always within, why did we need it to be hidden? Why does organized power fear the ungovernable blaze of the self-realized soul? What if the world isn't a divine masterpiece, but a prison built by lesser gods? What if your soul is not originally fallen, but imprisoned, amnesiac, and dreaming? And then, what does that say about salvation? Is it granted or remembered? You feel it now, that itch beneath your spiritual skin. That suspicion that something isn't adding up. That maybe, for your entire life, you've been playing a game whose rules were rigged before you ever took your first breath. That maybe, just maybe, the real Christ didn't come to die for your sins, but to awaken you from the lie that you're sinful at all. Do you see the contradiction? A savior who says the kingdom is within, yet a church who builds empires outside. A divine image imprinted on your soul, but a life spent begging for worth. A paradise lost to a bite of fruit, but gained again by blind obedience. It doesn't resolve. It fractures. And in that rupture lies the secret. You are not who they told you to be. God is not who they warned you to fear. The story doesn't start with creation, it starts with captivity. And until you ask why the light in you flickers despite a world burning with noise, you'll stay asleep. But those ancient Gnostics, hunted, exiled, erased, they left behind a trail. Manuscripts buried in clay jars. Verses encoded in metaphor. Secrets whispered like riddles in smoke. They believed gnosis is the only true salvation. Not belief, not repentance, not law. Knowing. Not in your head. In your being. And now the question is ringing like a cracked church bell in the cold dark morning of your soul. What truth was buried so deeply that even God wasn't allowed to speak it? The hidden problem and its psychological/philosophical roots. To understand why this truth was buried, why Gnostic thought was hunted like a plague, you must first understand the architecture of illusion. You were born into a story, one already in progress. A story where God is above, you are below, and your only hope is obedience. Sit still. Be faithful. Be afraid. Anything else is rebellion. Anything else is sin. But what if rebellion is not an act of pride, but the soul's attempt to remember who it is? Carl Jung once said, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents." But what happens when that burden runs deeper, not just through family but through centuries? When an entire civilization carries the unlived life of its spiritual ancestors? When mythology fossilizes into theology and mystery is replaced with control? You inherit more than genes. You inherit beliefs. Beliefs forged not by truth but by fear. Fear of chaos. Fear of freedom. Fear of the abyss beyond doctrine. The earliest Gnostics weren't just mystics, they were rebels of perception. They stood face to face with the naked machinery behind reality and realized a horrifying, liberating truth. The world is not what it seems. And the God of this world is not the true God. They saw through the veil. In Gnostic cosmology, the creator of the physical world is not the supreme deity but a lower, ignorant entity, the Demiurge. Born of imbalance, a blind architect. He fashions matter, proclaims himself God, and traps divine souls within his illusory creation. A fallen craftsman building a world of half-light and half-lie. This isn't blasphemy. It's psychology. The Demiurge is not merely an external being. It's a symbol of the ego, of the false self, of the internal tyrant who constructs a version of you defined by fear, shame, control, and scarcity. The part of you that says, I am what I have. I am what others say. I am never enough. And like the Demiurge, this voice is blind to its origin. Jean-Paul Sartre called it bad faith. Viktor Frankl spoke of the existential vacuum. Jung called it the shadow, the disowned parts of ourselves we hide, suppress, or project outward. Modern psychology calls it trauma reenactment. Organized religion, however, often calls it normal. We confuse conformity with clarity. But conformity always has a cost, your authenticity. You see, belief systems don't dominate cultures by being true. They dominate by being useful to the people in power. When the Roman Empire absorbed Christianity, it didn't do so out of reverence. It did it to codify compliance, to weld divinity to imperial law, to crucify mystery on the altar of law and order. The Gnostics threatened that order, not with swords but with questions. If salvation is found within, what need is there for priests? If heaven is a state of being, not a location, what need is there for empire? If sin is ignorance, not rebellion, then what does that say about punishment? Gnosticism is not atheism, nor is it a call to chaos. It's the terrifying realization that the map you were given is not the territory. It's a whisper that says, nothing real can be threatened. Nothing unreal exists. Consider Arthur Schopenhauer, who believed that the world we experience is not the world as it is, but the world as filtered through the will, an endless, irrational force, manifesting suffering and desire. And what is more irrational than a God who creates beings just to punish them for existing? The Gnostic lens reveals that this world, the world of time, decay, striving, and death, is not inherently sacred. It's a simulation not in the digital sense but in that it is derivative, imperfect, a copy of something higher. This is not nihilistic. It's revolutionary. Because once you realize the suffering of this world is not holy, you stop romanticizing it. You begin to question why we defend systems that extract, manipulate, and numb us, all while claiming to serve God. You start to ask dangerous questions. Why is faith rewarded when it's blind, but punished when it doubts? Why are we encouraged to feel guilt over desire, but pride over submission? Why is external virtue praised, but internal awakening ignored? The moment you question suffering, not as a test but as a symptom, you begin to see the structure beneath the story, the code in the illusion, the demiurge in your own mind. It's not just the world that's confused. You were taught that to be good, you must be ashamed. That to be loved, you must obey. But love that demands obedience is not love, it's ownership. And shame that masquerades as conscience is just inherited trauma in theological costume. You don't need to believe in the demiurge as a literal being to wake up to its influence. It exists wherever false narratives take root. It lives in dogmas designed to dim your inner fire. It thrives in systems that punish the seeker and reward the passive. The hidden problem is not that you were born broken. It's that you were taught to see your light as dangerous. Not because it is, but because it cannot be controlled. And so generations of seekers bowed before external altars, waiting for permission to feel divine, all while the God they searched for whispered from within, muffled by fear and doctrine. This is why Gnosis matters. Because it isn't knowledge you learn, it's truth you remember. A memory older than time. A fractal echo of the divine. A knowing that despite the noise of this constructed world, you are not what happened to you. You are not sin incarnate. You are a shard of something that never fell. But to reach it, you must unlearn the world, which means confronting the most sacred lies. And this is where it begins to hurt. because the closer you draw to truth, the louder illusion screams to pull you back. The church erased the Gnostic scriptures not because they were irrelevant, but because they were uncontrollable. Power can tolerate myths, it cannot tolerate awakening. But if the soul remembers, if even one ember of gnosis remains within you, then awakening is still possible. And once that fire is lit, the world you've known cannot survive it. The unseen consequences. You walk through the world, unaware that every step you take is guided by myths you didn't choose. You make decisions about love, about worth, about work, about God, not freely but through a prism of unconscious programming handed down for generations. You make choices from scripts you never wrote. You wonder why fulfillment feels elusive, like trying to drink water in a dream. And you blame yourself. You think, I must not be faithful enough, good enough, grateful enough. But what if you're not failing? What if you're trapped in a paradigm built to keep you searching and never finding? The consequences of living within illusion are not always loud. They are quiet, subtle, and devastating. They don't crash in, they settle like dust on sacred furniture. They become so familiar you don't even see them anymore. You try to pray but it feels empty. You try to live morally but it feels performative. You try to believe but the belief feels brittle, terrified of questions. What? Because gnosis was replaced with obedience? And obedience disconnected you from the only true compass, the inner voice, the divine spark. This is no longer just a theological problem. This is existential, psychological, neurological. You wake every day inside a body that holds memory not just of your life, but of generations who've been told they are inherently wrong. Original sin, they called it. What a cruel phrase. Imagine being born into the world and the first thing you're taught is that your essence is flawed. Imagine the psychic wound that slices through a child just beginning to ask, who am I? It doesn't vanish with age. It seeps into your attachment styles, into your capacity to love, into the silence you sit with at night when you're too tired to perform and too scared to feel. That doctrine, original sin, is not just about theology. It's a blueprint, a method of shaping identity around deficiency. Strip someone of their inherent worth, then offer them salvation through loyalty. Do you see it? It's not freedom. It's Stockholm Syndrome dressed in robes. From a psychological lens, this sets up a cycle. Shame, compliance, exhaustion, momentary relief, shame again. And round we go. The peripheral reward system in your brain, conditioned like a lab rat's. Dopamine surging when you feel accepted, serotonin dropping when you're not. You don't worship God. You chase approval. You don't seek transcendence. You seek relief. This is not what Christ meant by freedom. But if you lived your entire life mistaking your conditioning for your conscience, how would you ever know? The unseen consequence of losing gnosis is the loss of self. Not ego, not selfishness, but self. The deep, intuitive identity behind all masks. The divine blueprint hidden beneath trauma, status, and theology. The Gnostics called this hidden essence the divine spark. It's not given, it's remembered. But forgetting has consequences. You grow up internalizing the split between body and soul, between heaven and earth, between sacred and profane, and you start building a false self designed to be acceptable to others, but never quite aligned with what you feel inside. In Jungian terms, this is the inflation of the persona, the mask you wear to meet societal expectations. As it grows, it overshadows the shadow, the repressed self. And when the shadow grows large enough, it doesn't stay buried, it bursts. In depression, addiction, perfectionism, quiet despair. And the churches keep preaching. More faith, more sacrifice, more guilt. But the soul doesn't want more. It wants truth. Think of how society subtly reinforces the demiurgic reality, the belief that the material world is all that is, and that your value is measured in productivity, virtue signaling, and obedience wrapped in ritual. Spiritual bypassing becomes currency, behavioral purity replaces introspection. You become shiny but empty, polished but hollow. And elites, political, religious, economic, thrive on that emptiness, because it keeps you seeking meaning in systems rigged to only give you glimpses of it, but never the whole. Do you notice how our culture mimics the architecture of the Demiurge? Hierarchies based on fear, not love. Leaders who claim divine authority without divine humility. Institutions that define you through what you lack, not what you are. Even in therapy rooms, even in self-help books, the myth bleeds in. You are broken. Let us fix you. Rarely does anyone ask, what if you were never broken to begin with? What if your pain isn't from being born wrong, but from being taught to forget your own divinity? This is the cost of a world that lost gnosis. We don't know how to look inward anymore. Michel Foucault once said power is most effective not when it is enforced, but when it becomes internalized. That's the insidious brilliance of the exile of Gnosticism. It didn't vanish with persecution. It left a void, and that void was filled with tools to keep the soul docile. Not through violence, through distraction. Distraction from the truth that burns beneath you. You were told to seek salvation later, in heaven, at death. But Christ, the real Christ, the Gnostic Christ, whispered a heresy too dangerous to survive. The kingdom is within you, and it is now. This single sentence, if taken seriously, shatters empires. Because if you are sacred now, what happens to all the control systems built on your inadequacy? Power needs you to be waiting. Waiting for redemption. Waiting to be chosen. Waiting for a savior. But what if the savior wasn't Christ as an external God, but Christ as the symbol of inner awakening? Then everything changes. Because then resurrection becomes psychological, an uprising of the forgotten self. Then sin becomes sleep, and salvation becomes remembrance. And suddenly you find yourself trembling, not in fear of punishment, but in awe at the grandeur of what has been hiding inside you all along. And you might think, this is too much, too abstract, too mystical. But tell me, what's more insane, that you might be divine, or that you've been taught to hate yourself as an act of holiness? That's the deepest cost of losing gnosis, that we stopped recognizing ourselves. And in that forgetting, we forfeited agency, destiny, and sometimes even the will to live. But something ancient remains, even if you can't name it, even if you reject it, even if you are numb. Something within you rebels. A pressure, a crack in the surface, a knowing. You're not who they told you to be, the world is not what it pretends, and your soul is not a sinner, it's a sleeper. Waiting, watching, ready. And now the question becomes more urgent. If all this is true, if your pain has been the echo of a forgotten truth, how do you wake up? How do you rebel? The rebellion, how to break free. You don't escape a prison by rearranging the furniture. You escape by waking up to the fact that it was never a sanctuary to begin with. You thought you were in a cathedral, but the stained glass was steel bars, and the incense was smoke to cloud your vision. Breaking free from a worldview that enslaves you spiritually isn't a matter of abandoning faith. It's about burning every lie that taught you to fear your own light. And like all true revolutions, this one begins in silence. There will be no trumpet to announce your liberation. No map handed to you by priests or prophets. Because the rebellion Gnosticism offers, against the Demiurge, against unconsciousness, against every system that taught you to bow before false gods, is deeply personal. It won't be televised. It will feel like disintegration. The moment you begin to doubt the story, you stop being a character in it. You become the author. But beware, the Demiurge lives inside you too. He appears in your anxious thoughts that say you'll never survive without their approval, that he hides behind the instinct to apologize for existing too loudly, too differently, too freely. He cloaks himself in the voice that says, who are you to question? Who are you to know? He pretends to be your conscience, but he's just the echo of old chains. To rebel, you must do what few ever dare. Come face to face with yourself, unfiltered. Begin here, sit in stillness. Not the pious kind where you recite memorized prayers, but the raw kind where you feel the rage, the grief, the confusion. Where your pain becomes a compass pointing to every part of your soul you were taught to hide. Become intimate with your darkness, not to indulge it, but to integrate it. Carl Jung taught that what you resist, persists. Every part of you that's rejected doesn't die, it festers. Every desire suppressed in the name of virtue doesn't vanish, it metastasizes into shame, addiction, projection. The Gnostics knew this. They knew light only becomes real through contrast. That awakening wasn't about becoming perfect, it was about becoming whole. The self, reassembled from the shards the world tried to break. You are not just the saint, you are also the serpent, the garden, the fall, the awakening. And this isn't blasphemy, it's balance. Do you remember the Garden of Eden story? How Eve disobeyed, ate the fruit, invited death? But the Gnostics saw it differently. They said Eve didn't fall, she awoke. The serpent wasn't Satan, it was Sophia, the divine wisdom in disguise, urging humanity to remember what they are. The knowledge of good and evil wasn't a curse, it was a key. And what happened after Eve ate the fruit? The Demiurge got angry that he cast them out of his false paradise. Not because they sinned, but because they saw. Your awakening may feel like exile too. You may lose community, family, even parts of your identity that once brought you comfort. But exile is not the same as damnation. It's the price of sovereignty. Jesus, in Gnostic texts like the Gospel of Thomas, doesn't preach sin, suffering, or submission. He says something that shatters all religious hierarchy. If those who lead you say to you, "See, the kingdom is in the sky," then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, "It is in the sea," then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is within you. This is rebellion. To stop searching outward. To disassemble the altar if it keeps you from entering your own temple. But rebellion is more than rejection. It's recreation. It's what Jean-Paul Sartre meant when he said, "Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself." It's what Nietzsche meant when he wrote, "One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star." It's in shaking the pillars not to destroy faith, but to see what still stands when the false idols fall. Start asking yourself terrifying questions. Not the gentle affirmations of self-help cliches, but the kind that feel like staring into a void. Who told me I was unworthy? When did I begin to fear my own intuition? Why do I associate doubt with danger? Why do I believe salvation must come through suffering? These questions are knives, but through them you carve out your freedom. And then, after enough silence, enough grief, enough courage to disassemble the mental architecture of oppression, something begins to stir. You recognize the divine isn't above you. It is you. Not your ego, not your roles, but your being, the eye behind thought, the watcher behind the storm. You don't have to name it. The Gnostics called it pleroma, the fullness. It's the source you were exiled from, only to realize it was never lost. How do you return? By descending inward. The Gnostics spoke of the soul's journey through the archons, guardian forces that each represent a distortion of truth. Pride, fear, desire. Each one must be faced, not fled. These aren't supernatural demons, they are patterns, traumas, conditions. As you uproot them layer by layer, the real you begins to emerge from underneath the rubble. Not created, revealed. Rebellion means you stop negotiating with inner tyrants. You stop dragging your soul across broken glass just to prove your worth. You start breathing like the entire universe is inhaling through you. 'Cause maybe it is. And now something astonishing occurs. Your rebellion, so inward and silent, begins to change how you move in the world. You no longer pray to be saved. You walk as if you were never lost. You don't try to convert anyone. But your presence, calm, grounded, wild, begins to disturb those still bound by lies. Not because you're trying to provoke, but because truth is contagious to those who are starving for it. And like an ember passed hand to hand through the centuries, gnosis catches. You may become the heretic in someone else's story. Let them call you that. Let them misunderstand your freedom as madness, because the price of awakening has always been exile from the hive. But oh, the view from this place, unchained, unbidden, drenched in the thunderous silence of direct communion. This is rebellion. Not loud, but ancient. Not angry, but immovable, not against God, but against every chain forged in His name. And in reclaiming yourself, you begin to rewrite the collapse of the human spirit into something else entirely. Restoration, resurrection, return. But there is one more thing you must see. Something deeper still. Because even rebellion can become an identity. Even awakening, if misunderstood, can be a new form of sleep. To truly be free, you must go beyond even this. Are you ready? The ultimate truth, the final, most powerful realization. You thought rebellion was the end. You imagined that once the lies were burned, once the chains were broken, once the illusion collapsed beneath the sheer weight of your awakening, that clarity would finally arrive like daylight spilling through broken bars. But it doesn't. Not yet. Because freedom terrifies those who have known only cages. You stare into the mirror, stripped of illusion, and ask, now what? You've confronted the God who punishes. You've dismantled the myths of inherited sin. You've even touched truth, not with your intellect but with your being. And yet something still aches. Because now that you are no longer bound, you realize you are weightless, untethered, floating in the abyss of an open sky. The map is ash. The temple has no walls. The gates are off their hinges. And the soul? The soul is silent. This is the final paradox. You rebelled to remember who you are. But now that you stand outside the story, free from its grip, you realize something staggering. There was never a you to be saved. Not in the way you thought, not the persona, not the self-image, not the seeker. The self you thought you were, the identity crafted by opposites, by stories, by wounds and triumphs, is itself the last veil. Now you stand before the true hidden chamber. And what you find there is not an answer. It is the dissolution of the question. You are not a soul inside a body, You are not a spark within matter. You are not a thing separate seeking reunion with God. You are the field itself, the source peering through an infinite number of eyes. You didn't awaken to find yourself. You awakened to the truth that there was never separation. The Gnostics called this pleroma, the fullness, where all opposites dissolve. No higher, no lower, no creator, no created. Only the seamless union beyond language, beyond duality. This is what makes Gnosis not just a mystical insight but a death. The death of the final illusion, that you and the divine are two. And in that moment, as all concepts dissolve, there is peace. Not the peace of certainty. That's still an ego trying to grasp. Not the peace of comfort. That's nostalgia wrapped in fear. No, this peace has no reason, no justification, no opposite. It's the peace that comes when the mind stops needing to arrive, because it sees it was never separate. Perhaps you still want a name for this. Call it unity, call it God, call it silence. But that too is the residue of the mind. The truth lives before names. Even God is too small. Because the God you thought you were seeking, the one above, the one apart, the one who judges and saves, is just the final veil of the Demiurge. A mental projection built of opposites, good and evil, heaven and hell, right and wrong. The true divine cannot be thought, only realized, not believed. Breathe. And then you see, the Gnostics weren't proclaiming a new religion. They were deconstructing the very idea of needing one. That's why they were exiled. That's why their texts were burned. Not because they were dangerous to souls, but because they were dangerous to systems. Because a soul that knows itself has no master. And a world full of such people cannot be controlled. Nietzsche once said, God is dead. But the Gnostics might say, no. The false God never truly lived, only ruled. And now even that rule ends, not in war, but in awakening. This is the final turning. From seeker to silence, from rebel to presence, from I am to simply this. You don't need to struggle for meaning anymore. You don't need to overcome, conquer, or prove. Everything trying to be something falls into the background like a dream fading upon waking. You were the truth even in your forgetting. The error wasn't sin. It was identification with what you are not. You are not your name, your pain, your past, or your persona. You are not your religion, your virtue, your trauma, or your desire. You are not even your story. You are the space in which all stories rise and fall. And from this vantage point, this unshakable stillness, you look back on the entire drama. The Demiurge, the doctrines, the seeking, the suffering, even your rebellion. And you see it for what it truly is, a dream of separation, a necessary stage in the soul's remembering. Nothing was wasted. Even the false gods played their part. Even the lies helped shape the path. Even the forgetting was sacred. Because how could light ever know itself? Without the experience of shadow? You are not here to escape the world. You are here to remember it's not what it seems. You are not here to reject your humanity. You are here to divinize it, by bringing presence into every moment as if it were God dancing in drag. Because perhaps it is. Imagine walking now, not as one who seeks but as one who sees. Not to preach, convince, or judge, but simply to be. To live with eyes open, heart unarmored, breath unburdened, not because you know more, but because you need to know less. You don't fight the illusion anymore. You simply stop mistaking it for reality. And others may still call you heretic. Let them. They are still asleep, drafting blueprints for prisons you've already left behind. You will not go back. Not because of pride, but because the cell no longer exists. It was always open. The world will try to pull you back in, to offer new identities, updated belief systems, causes, tribes, labels. Remember, the final temptation is not darkness. It's conformity dressed as light. Let it pass. You don't need to call yourself awakened. You don't even need peace. What lives in you now is beyond such things. Call it love. Call it eternal light. Call it nothing at all. Just stay here, breathing, knowing, being. Because in the end, Gnosticism wasn't a doctrine to follow. It was a truth to embody. A spark awaiting friction. A fire longing to free someone, anyone, from the sleep of second-hand living. And now it lives in you. So walk. Not to arrive, but because every step you take in remembrance rewrites the dream for someone else still sleeping.